At RTC, we've been paying close attention to changes that are taking place all around us that affect mobility in America. A transportation revolution has begun with fundamental implications for our work on trail networks. None of us know for sure how much or how quickly this change will occur, but we can examine the recent past for trends and prepare ourselves for various likely scenarios. For example, consider the myriad changes that have taken place in just the last 10 years. There's been the rise of the national walking movement. We've got Kate Kraft here. It really had previously had very little visibility or clout. It's rooted in communities. It's championed by former federal leaders such as the Surgeon General and the Secretary of Transportation. Further, real estate development over the last decade has really centered on walkable urban environments accessible to transit. Of course, near and dear to our hearts, trail and active transportation networks have become a mainstream priority in an ever-increasing number of regions throughout the country, as is evidenced by all of you in the room. And this reflects a rising demand for connected, convenient biking and walking routes for mobility, fitness, and recreation, with trails as the gold standard for low traffic stress conditions appealing to all ages and abilities. There's also the ubiquity of the still seemingly magical to me smartphones, with apps that summon a car and driver on demand, lead you to a shared car, bike, or scooter, or tell you exactly how and when you'll get somewhere by any mode of transportation. The shared bike or scooter now may be free roaming and or electric, and this is opening this new mobility option to more places and people of varying abilities. And we've caught the first glimpses of technologies under development, for better or worse, that are likely to reshape our communities and the ways we get around in the future, such as automated vehicles, robots, and drones. The role of our movement at this juncture includes identifying needs and advocating for opportunities and principles that should govern how these changes are managed. To that end, RTC's Partnership for Active Transportation is building a consensus among diverse national organizations regarding principles for human-centered mobility. And we think that phrase is going to be very central to what this panel has to say. We aim to ensure that our evolving communities are and feel safe and convenient for those who walk and roll, that streets are managed as public space, and that equity is a core value and that public engagement is genuine. We decided this summit needed to explore this topic in the context of trail networks. What will it take to put people first as technologies remake our mobility patterns and reshape our communities? Will it get easier or harder for Americans to walk or bike when and where they want? Will multi-use trails separated from motor vehicle traffic become even more essential to ensuring that communities are safe and livable for people of all ages, abilities, ethnicities, and incomes? Today we have an outstanding panel, it's coming up in just a second, to address the many challenges and opportunities that the future holds for mobility in the built environment, including trails. Our moderator is Laura Bliss, a reporter with CityLab, who has written extensively and thoughtfully about the intersection of transportation, infrastructure, and technology. Laura is going to guide a conversation with our panelists, who are Heather Deutsch, an RTC alum and Senior Planning Associate at ALTA. We've got Robin Hutcheson, Vice President of the Board of the National Association of City Transportation Officials and the Director of Public Works in Minneapolis. We've got Keith Laughlin, the President of RTC. And we've got Blaine Merker, who's U.S. Managing Director at Gehl, an international urban design firm that emphasizes the relationship between quality of life and the built environment. So with that, we'll have the panel come up, and I will hand it over to Laura to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Kevin. That was great. So let's just start with a little bit of a participatory exercise. How many of us have a smartphone in this room? Raise your hands. Yeah, so pretty much 100%. How many of us have ever used Uber or Lyft or another kind of on-demand ride-hailing service, right? How many of us have used a dockless scooter or bike or any of those kinds of services before? Okay, more like 30% of us. It's probably a dockless bike scooter biased crowd, I imagine. Who's ever ridden in an autonomous vehicle? One of the trials? Great. Less of us, right? This is still obviously a transportation mode that we hear a lot about, but that is, in actuality, right, years or decades away in terms of us seeing autonomous vehicles full autonomy widely adopted in our communities. But that certainly hasn't stopped folks in the transportation world, including in the walking and biking advocacy world, from thinking about what the implications are for this coming technology. The opportunities, as Kevin was describing, do seem to be enormous in some respects, right? If we have cars that are on demand and able to be shared, cities could potentially correct what many would call the mistakes of the 20th century, when cities were sort of carved up to make way for highways and cars. With shared cars, on-demand cars, people could actually fit more people into one vehicle, right, and make more space on the road for pedestrians and cyclists. We could eliminate traffic fatalities, right, pretty dramatically, and make safer streets for people in cars and on sidewalks and in bike lanes. But of course, that's probably only going to happen if people in this room and outside of it, people who care about walking and cycling within urban spaces and outside of them in the trail context, make it happen, right? We think about the risk potential, especially when we look at Uber and Lyft, which are already here, and the changes that they're already bringing about in communities. The future could kind of go the other direction, right? We could see more cars on the street as the convenience and low cost of these services continues to drive adoption. The algorithms, right, that get written into the software that drive the vehicles might not be as respectful or even aware of pedestrians and cyclists as it should be. And it's clear too, right, just as already, every one of us has a smartphone in this room, but not everybody does, right? And not everybody is able to access credit cards and bank accounts that enable them to use services that already exist. So those gaps could also continue to widen. So what does that have to do with trails, right? We're at the TrailNation Summit. Well, the Rails to Trails movement has long been about repurposing space, and that's a big part of the conversation in terms of what the transportation future holds. And I also am interested in how, as on-demand vehicles, increasingly move in and turn into autonomous vehicles potentially, how might the advocacy base of folks like yourselves in this room potentially be harnessed to make sure there's more space for walking and biking everywhere in all kinds of contexts. Because even if this technology is years away, or some of it, right? I mean, these iPhones are just 10 years old, right? And we all have them in this room. Uber and Lyft are even younger, but everyone has used them. So it's happening. So I'm thrilled to be joined by these awesome panelists. We had a warm-up conversation earlier that now the pressure's on because it's going to be just as good, if not better. So I'd love to start with you, Heather, and talk about, we had a great phone call yesterday where we talked about sometimes because maybe the physical space of trails it is separate, right? By nature, it is separate from shared streets, urban environments where all these technological changes are happening. There can sometimes be sort of a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, these topics aren't really relevant to this conversation about trails, right? And a kind of reaction to look away. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think, having worked on trails, sort of focused on trails for a number of years, we're really looking at this infrastructure that in many ways is separated from the roadway. It connects to sidewalks and bikeways, but in many respects, it is its own sort of infrastructure, its own travel way. And so as we see the disruptions that are happening on our city streets, one question is, how do these things overlap? One, I think, is the opportunity to look at the new space that could be created in the same ways that we looked at, the unused rail corridors of yesterday. That is where the whole Rails to Trails movement came from. And so we have the opportunity to ask again, if we have this extra space, how can we use it to, preserve it for any sort of future use, whatever we want our future to look like. So there's a lot of great opportunity there, as well as just the way that trails connect in with city streets and city infrastructure. I know just as someone who designed trails, one of the big questions was, how do you actually get the community connected into the trail? And it was usually very car focused. Bikes would be on the road and, we might have some sidewalks, but how do we create those connections? Now we have the opportunity to make those connections potentially much more bicycle and pedestrian and all the other different modes of transportation that are up and coming. One of the other things I think is really important for us to think about, and it makes me think about inline skaters. So, 10, 15 years ago, the big issue was how do we design trails to accommodate inline skaters? Because they take up so much width, right? And it's back, and and it was all the level of service calculator for trails. There's always this inline skater element. And I don't know, I've heard that, they're kind of coming back, but what I'm really seeing is, skateboarders and of course, the electrified everything is out there. And our first reaction, or what I see as our first reaction, is this very sort of negative, like, oh, we can't go there sort of thing. And I think things for us to be aware of is that we should always have principles about how we want the future of our lives in our built environment to sort of be constructed, and that's what a lot of this conversation is going to be about. And with that, we need to figure out what's working and what's not working with all this new technology, and establish policies and design guidelines that allow us to harness everything that's going on while also creating the future that we want. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like how you put it in terms of the parallel of repurposing space, right? Which I think this conversation will probably keep coming back to. Blaine, I'd like to ask you to give us this is a tough question, but like a synopsis of how smartphones, going all the way back, right, to sort of the start of this already happening, transformation in technology and transportation. How has the smartphone changed walking?
Wow. I'm just going to say I am not a smartphone expert. I'm a smartphone user. So this is going to be just sort of personal observation, I guess, as much as anything. I think that the thing we don't talk about enough in the urban environment is attention. That we all have this finite amount of attention to spend on, thinking about what we're doing next, taking in cues from the environment, not getting hurt, and not getting killed. And actually, this is, I think, one of the things that is the unwritten rule of streets is don't get hurt. And I really want to challenge, I think we all know that, right? We tell our kids, not to run out in the street. There's a certain amount of blame we might associate with a pedestrian who gets hurt. Were they following the rules? Were they doing the right thing? I think one of the things that we at Gehl kind of want to challenge is, should that ever be, and this is the Vision Zero premise too, is that should that ever be the question about walking in a street or in the urban environment should spontaneously get you killed if you don't pay attention. So I really challenge this premise that actually we need to pay attention. Paying attention shouldn't be a requirement of living in urban spaces. So provocation maybe. So where the smartphone comes in is that it competes for this limited share of attention that we've established as part of the rules of not getting hurt. And I think that's why you see kind of the conversation shifting now to distracted walking being an urban hazard of the phone. And I would just suggest maybe that's the wrong question to ask. That maybe we should be sort of asking about what level of attention should be required to operate in the city in the first place. So I wandered off a little bit from phones, but I think that's the sort of the context that I see it in is we are in this the phone has created a world where we're being challenged, our limited mind share is being challenged at every moment now. There's almost no moment where we can sort of let our attention wander or slow down. There is always a message to check. There's always something to do, to multitask. And I feel like in terms of the psychological experience, that's been the progression of the phone in the last 10 years. It's been my experience. And how that relates to the city is that I think we have to make cities that compete with that. We have to have cities that compete. They're just as interesting. There's just as much reason to sort of intuitively unplug from your phone as there is to check your phone. You know, the human brain needs about 1,000 stimuli an hour to feel sort of awake and engaged. And so that means that we have to say something interesting up here every 4 seconds, otherwise you'll start checking your phones.
A lot of pressure.
Timing.
As I'm watching, and in the urban environment at a walking pace, that translates into something to see about every 25 feet, or if you're on a bike, you know, a little further. So I think there's a relationship between urban form and the phone, whereas our urban environment gets a little more dull, we check our phones more often. And I think that's a challenge for us as urban designers to think about that.
Kind of bouncing off of that, Keith, I'd like to ask a question. You know, phones in the trail context, I think one of the kind of my knee-jerk reaction even might be, oh yeah, phone, even if you're just listening to use it, you know, using it to listen to music or maybe hopping on a phone call or checking your map, I mean, that is a distraction. Maybe there's some kind of loss there of the, you know, meditative, contemplative benefits of using trail spaces, and I wonder, like, respond to that.
Well, I mean, I think the question would be, does the phone sort of distract or detract from the trail experience? And I think that, for the most part, I would say going back to what was said, if that trail is sufficiently interesting, it in and of itself will provide the stimulus needed to engage the user. And that I don't think there's any trail that I've been on so boring that I've wanted to pull out my phone to distract myself. At the same time, I think there's some real pluses to the technology just in terms of navigation. And that is that, you know, a lot of trails and things are not well signed. They're not always easy to find. It's not always easy to know where you are on the trail. And so I think the technology can actually aid in improving the trail experience by making all those things easier, and it doesn't necessarily have to detract from it.
And on the same kind of line of questioning, I mean, do you remember, you know, 10 years ago when smartphones were really coming into widespread adoption? Like, do you remember kind of what the feeling was in the trails advocacy world?
At that point, I don't think that anybody ever made a clear connection between the technology and the impact that it's had. I don't think there's any doubt that the impact has been huge in terms of what it has done, in terms of particularly in terms of transportation behaviors. I think that it's opened up a whole new set of opportunities in terms of mobility that weren't anticipated at all back in 2007 when the first iPhone was released. And I think that has sort of rippled and had effects on trails as a result. But looking back in 2007, I'm not sure anybody would have anticipated what these impacts have been. And I think people are still figuring this out. I mean, I think there's been a lot of changes in travel behavior that we don't even really understand yet. And it's because of a lot of the technology that really is so new, but it really is changing our behaviors.
Yeah, Robin, maybe you can kind of hop on top of that and bring in Uber, Lyft, on-demand transportation services, smartphone-based transportation services. What are the changes that we're already seeing happen in urban and shared street contexts, and feel free to kind of fold in trail stuff?
Sure. I really like what Heather said about harnessing technology to reach goals and to really work for a city or a town, and also recognizing where maybe it's not doing that thing that you want it to do. And so when I think about Uber and Lyft, I think about both of those things. One is it has provided better mobility for those who cannot drive. And someone who has a smartphone who does not live near a bus line or otherwise transit, I need to come back to transit later because we have to talk about that, now has better access to somewhere that they need to go, healthcare, school, job, whatever it is. The flip side is that there is some evidence now, measured and observed, that vehicle miles traveled in urban environments is increasing because of people's use of Uber and Lyft. It's early evidence. I believe it because I am seeing it in my own city. NACTO believes it because we are seeing it over and over again in cities that the environment is changing. Not only do we think that vehicle miles traveled is increasing, we also think, and this is where I'm going to take it back to trails, we also think that space is becoming less and less organized. That the progress that we've made on our streets to make them as trail-like as possible, so as people-centered as possible, is being chipped away at in some instances by an increase in vehicles stopping and starting for personal destination use. So I think it's worth thinking about how it can be reframed so that it preserves both the mobility benefits of having service like that, and also how it can be reframed so that we don't fill cities and towns with single occupant vehicles, and if we're talking about an autonomous future, potentially, just let this sink in, 0 occupant vehicles now, and chip away at what we're really trying to do, which is a people-centered transportation network.
So maybe you could point to specific cities or ideas that that are proactively kind of harnessing the technology, as you say.
Can I use my own city?
Please.
Okay. We're as young as anyone, and any city in the room in our understanding and our education level about technology and how it's shaping cities. But we know one thing for sure in Minneapolis, and that is that we are interested in shared mobility because we think it gets us a better outcome. We are interested in autonomous mobility if it gets us the outcomes that we want. And if we're going to test something, we're going to do it with both of those things, but only with those things. So twice now in Minneapolis, we've done a test of an autonomous vehicle. It's a bus, it's a shuttle, and we've done 2 tests. One was during the Super Bowl, which I had a small heart attack when someone proposed that we test an autonomous vehicle, on the Nicollet Mall, if anyone's seen it, during the Super Bowl with, 1,000 news stations in town. But it went really well, it was great. And we were able to test that in the urban environment with people walking and biking near it and around it. How does this work with people? And it carries 8 people at a time. That's the only way we want to go down this path. We tested it again. Again, a small coronary when the test was proposed on the Midtown Greenway. So has anyone been on the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis? It's like an amazing trail, right? It's like a flagship trail of all trails in the country. We're so proud of it in Minneapolis. Well, the county wanted to test this vehicle on that greenway, and we felt so protective of that people space. But in the end, we signed off and gave them a permit to do it because we also want to understand, we also know that this shared mobility, this autonomous mobility, we know that it has to work with people biking and walking. It's non-negotiable. It is non-negotiable. So we let the test go ahead, but made them do a tremendous amount of pre-testing prior to make sure that the vehicle interacted with people biking and walking. And the test actually occurs on a trail with people coming close to it, with people riding their bikes by it. And we had great results. We learned so much. And we did these tests with our goals in mind first.
You can expand on that, Blaine, outside of the Minneapolis context. There's this kind of concept, and I think what Robin has been getting at is all about it. Like, there could be this heaven version of, autonomous vehicles, on-demand vehicles, all kinds of, dockless bikes, and there could also be the hell. I mean, we kind of have been outlining what those 2 things look like. But so say more about like what the most kind of synergistic, happy outcome looks like, and specifically for pedestrians and cyclists.
Yeah, I mean, so we're at this inflection point right now. I think we can all feel it. And I've started to say this everywhere I go now because I'm trying to get everyone to really pay attention that the next 5 or 10 years really, really matter. If you go back to the 1920s, 1930s and look at how, what's collectively called motordom, which is kind of car companies, oil makers, oil companies, tire makers, got together and reframed what the street was for. It was an active cultural campaign. We are right before another one of those that is around things like autonomous vehicles. We're already sort of seeing it happen with rideshare, ride-hailing. And it's not to say that it'll go the same way, but it is in, I think, the interests of these businesses to sort of redefine the street and own it in the way that helps those technologies. And so what we need to do, I think, at this moment is refocus on the human being, on the person. We all know what human beings need, and I think we're experts in that because we each have a body, we each have experience being out in the world. We walk in the sun when it's cold, we walk in the shade when it's hot. It's real simple stuff, and I think that constantly gets lost in the discussion about technology. That we focus on the tool instead of what we're trying to use the tool for. So the heaven version, I think, is just simply a version where we start with the human being as the unit of design. And that's where I think the trail movement has a lot to share with the rest of the world, with the rest of the design community, because it's already a territory that's very human-focused. And so I think the principles that have been learned over the last few decades in trail design and what really makes them a great human space should actually be applied back out to city streets. And we should use that to drive the development of these tools and autonomous vehicles and ride-hailing and so on. I think there's cities around the country who are tackling this problem in really interesting ways. NACTO is doing great work to get, I think, specific tools and codes into the hands of cities. And in our work, we work all around the US. We've worked in over 250 cities around the world. We're seeing that cities are kind of taking that human-focused approach as a economic development starting point. People want to spend more time in cities and locate there, and talent is attracted and retained when there's a real human-focused environment that they can live in. So I would just say that the heaven version is where we start the design of every space with that human focus. The hell version is where we don't pay attention for 10 years and wake up and Silicon Valley has provided the answer for us.
I see a couple tack-ons. I'm going to let Heather jump on
Yeah,
first.
one of the things, and you had mentioned it, but I think it's really important for us to remember how much space personal vehicles take up. So whether you are Ubering someplace, one of the things we talk about a lot with ride sharing is how much parking how many free parking spaces that it will provide. But of course the downside is, we're seeing increases in congestion. And it really just comes down to the fact that you're taking up a tremendous amount of space to move, one person. And so it's important for us to recognize whether we're parked, autonomous vehicles are waiting for us someplace using parking spaces, or if they're moving us individually and traveling from one person to the next between taking these trips, how much is general space they take up. And so if we want to reallocate that space, we first have to make sure that that space exists. And it only exists if we recognize how much space these vehicles will take up. And I think that when we start to focus on moving, people either walking or bicycling on our city streets, we reallocate that space. We also have the opportunity of creating more advocates.
There's you touched on
Sorry,
lots of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
Come back to many of those things. Yeah, I'm going to let Keith jump in because I know you want to say.
I think, I'm not sure that I'd ever call it the heaven scenario, but for us, the optimistic scenario, I think there are two essential conditions. One is if we have these autonomous vehicles, they really need to be shared fleets. They can't be individually owned in terms of most of them, or we will have a lot of zero occupancy vehicles plugging up our cities, our communities, and reducing quality of life, I think, in a very serious way. So, first of all, they need to be shared fleets. Second of all, this is going to require some redesign of our communities. And I think that as a general principle, we have to say people come first in the redesign of the communities. We have to redesign them around people and not around machines. We made that mistake back in the 50s and 60s. We have a chance to improve on that. And I think that ultimately, to me, if it is a heaven scenario, there's one thing that's crucial in this, and that's parking. At the present time, there are about 8 parking places for every car in the United States. And that's primarily because we really don't drive our cars that much. Cars, for the most part, are parked 95% of the time and only driven about 4% of the time. So you need to have all of those parking places out there. And that is a tremendous drain in terms of human public space in our communities. If we could flip that scenario with shared fleets, and if those cars were in operation 95% of the time and parked less than 5% of the time, we could end up with a situation where we would need far less parking to provide the same amount of mobility as a service. And if we don't need it that much parking, imagine a future where we had no demand for on-street parking. If that were the case, just think about how we could repurpose that public space for walking and biking. And I think that is the opportunity that we have if we anticipate this change and if we're out in front of it. And if we're not, sleeping for the next 10 years and waiting to see what happens. Because if we wait to see what happens, we're going to get a nightmare scenario. If we anticipate it, if we plan for it, if we advocate for it, this could be a huge opportunity for what will be road to trail projects.
And maybe let's drill down a little bit more into the nightmare part of things. Right? And I'm going to stay with you for a minute, Keith, to keep it on trails in particular. As, in the sort of nightmare version, convenience, low cost of shared on-demand autonomous vehicles increases the number of cars in the street, increases vehicle miles traveled overall. Do trail networks become this even more intensely needed space for respite and safe walking? I mean, what sort of happens to demand on that kind of infrastructure?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on my second point, and that is redesigning the communities around people. And now, even if the first one is a nightmare in terms of them not being shared, that second one is still essential, because if we don't do that, we risk, in terms of that nightmare scenario, we risk really having streets that are once again designed around cars, and that means that pedestrians and cyclists will continue to be an afterthought with really negative connotations. And I think that one thing that's important here is that the experience for the walker and biker is important. It's not enough just for it to be safe, because I think it's potentially possible to make, with the technology, to almost get to zero, vision zero kind of outcomes, but it could still be hellish in terms of people walking and biking in those kinds of situations. And so I think that's what we really have to be vigilant about, trying to protect the quality of that walking and biking experience in those places. Safety is absolutely important, but if we're not, vigilant, that nightmare scenario could include just, taking our lives into our hands anytime we step off the curb.
Bouncing to you, Robin, kind of expand on that. You mentioned the autonomous shuttle that was tested over Super Bowl weekend. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about what the city actually learned, thinking about risks and benefits from that pilot.
Risks and benefits of the pair of pilots that we did. Risk, I have to say, my heaven version involves health and safety.
Yeah, feel
first
free
and
to
foremost. So my heaven version
expand on
is
that too.
is health and safety, and street design is very much about the person and keeping the person safe. Vision zero is widespread health and safety, and so if I reflect on the first test, health and safety was the very first thing we were looking at. I was very stressed out about it. It was a rough lead up week to it, because I had to kind of trust the experts that brought this technology to us, which is happening more and more. Technology is moving faster than we are. The private sector brings new ideas to us, and we have to find some amount of professional expertise that we lend to it, but also a little bit of trust. I learned not to fear it. I did learn not to fear it because I saw how it worked. I stepped in front of it. I had to, I just needed to know. And I learned that there is good technology out there. And there are parts of it that we can embrace. And I'm interested in doing more piloting and testing as long as it is meeting our goals. I think this is an absolute NACTO tenet too, is what about technology can further the goals that cities generally share amongst each other. Health and safety is a huge one. Environmental benefit, and that's not just about tailpipe emission, it's also about using the street to treat stormwater by providing extra space that you didn't have before. Prosperity and access to jobs, and that is very much the goal that is attached to testing a shuttle bus versus testing a single vehicle. It has to be equity goals, and a huge part about equity goals, it has to be accessible to everyone, not just those who can either afford to buy an autonomous vehicle, that have 78% of people, I think it is, that have a smartphone that can call up an Uber or a Lyft. Somehow it's got to be accessible to everyone. So the learnings from the test, just back to that, is embrace the things you want. I was able to embrace the things that we want out of it and look for those outcomes. And I learned that we should be very choosy about the kinds of pilots and tests and very choosy about the technologies that we invite in to work with us, but that we should do it.
So how do communities actually do that, right? Like how do they sort of get in front of the consultants and the tech companies that are coming in and saying, these are the technologies we have available, especially, when we see testing happening unsafely, right? There's been a number of fatal crashes involving autonomous or semi-autonomous cars recently, including Uber in March, where the self-driving car actually hit and killed a pedestrian walking her bike. And that was because the software, right? Well, lots of factors involved, but part of it seemingly, right, because the pedestrian detection system had been turned down, right, to avoid false biases. So yeah, when there's sort of that level of technical expertise, it's sort of determining how these machines are built. How do sort of community advocates, trail advocates get involved? Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
I think you can't overemphasize the importance of the work that Robin's doing with NACTO, because this is the kind of thing that not every community is going to be able to get up the learning curve and figure this out themselves. So by having an organization that is really serving all of city transportation officials in putting together the policies and putting together sort of the strategies for how this technology gets implemented is extremely important in terms of ensuring that those outcomes are much more positive. And at the same time, I think that organizations such as ours and other nonprofits have to be organized to support the work that they're doing, so that this notion of partnership here, I think, is really important between the nonprofit sector and the public sector in order to figure this out, to get in front of it, because each community themselves are not going to be able to do it. And I think finally, I would say, the more that we can bring the private sector into that discussion, in terms of some of the companies, in terms of Ford or Lyft or some other companies, they are saying some of the right things in terms of how this is going to evolve. But I think we really have to be working with them to make sure that as it evolves, that we actually end up the outcomes that we want in reality, and it's not just talk.
Yeah.
Perfect transition, yes.
Well, I totally agree, and I think so. The leadership of NACTO and of local transportation officials and people working at the department level in cities, along with elected leadership, is the sort of magic combination. And we're seeing that happening in more and more places around the country. We're working with the city of San Jose right now, which is, if you've been there, you know it's not a people-first city. It's not very much fun to get around. It's really kind of the automobile, utopia of the 50s. But the entire city, from the mayor to the council on through the department leadership, has taken on this notion of people-first design as their organizing principle across all planning now. They've moved towards publicly adopting this as a policy. It's not a separate plan. It's a lens to put all planning through. And so I think that kind of approach is exactly what you need. I think you have to have all the departments kind of on board with that idea, because there are benefits to health, there are benefits to stormwater, there are benefits to less cost in infrastructure. So I think it's about kind of convening that discussion. And again, this is where I would say the Trails movement has a lot to offer. As Kevin was saying, I think that we're going to see maybe a blurring, of trails into streets. Streets can become what trails have been for the last 20 years, which is this place for people to be. So I think that's an exciting potential development, and cities have this huge public space dividend that's about to potentially get paid by the removal of parking. So seize this opportunity, and I think seize it to create a narrative at the leadership level to kind of bring that lens to the focus.
I was going to say something else, but I changed my mind because now I want to address something else. I said, you are the original people-centered transportation movement. Before we even started talking about rethinking our streets, which is, born about 20 years ago and has gained tremendous momentum in the last 10, before that, there were trails and trail advocates, the spines in communities, the original backbone of people-centered transportation. And we're trying to do what you've been doing. We're trying to take our streets and bring that people-centered to the streets. I know where, in a couple places I've worked, Salt Lake City, NACTA organization, Minneapolis, NACTA organization, and areas I've consulted in, most of them NACTA organizations, we're replicating your work. We're replicating what you're doing by repurposing the space that's in the street to make it more for people. It's really challenging, and there's usually a big fight, but it's so rewarding because we get to extend the trail into the urban environment.
Yes, go for it.
Sorry, I just want to add on one more thing, and sorry to monopolize, but this is an exciting, I think opportunity. The other challenge I would just put though to all of us is to not think about these as isolated projects and a trail as an isolated thing. And I think one of the things that technology has to offer is a real good design technique for thinking about end-to-end user experience. And I think that's kind of the next level with this, is to not think about someone driving to a trail, using it for their human-centered experience that they don't get because their street is terrible, and then driving home and spending the rest of the day in their car. But thinking about how do you add all these things together to create one one human-focused experience, whether it's on streets, on trails, or anywhere else. So I think we've had to think about these as more isolated projects in the past just to get them done, but now we're at a moment where we can start kind of joining them together.
Yeah, and Heather, I'm sure you're dying to jump in at this point, and just to kind of put a different twist on where the conversation has flowed, which is exactly as I planned. One of the things I find most fascinating and compelling about the Trails advocacy movement is how, to build a trail regionally, it has to be the product of lots of communities working together, right? If you want to get from big, beyond the confines of your particular town. And I wonder if there's something to be said for that kind of lesson, looking outside the trail-specific context to reworking space with all this stuff in mind.
Yeah, I think kind of touching on both of these points, one is that I think one of the reasons that we see a change from people driving to using Uber and sort of staying within a vehicle, but having, taking that same trip, is because we haven't really changed the built environment. It's still unsafe, unpleasant, and we don't actually want to drive there, but we still don't want to walk. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not enough just to create the policies if the people themselves don't want to get out of the vehicle. And so that is our opportunity to not only say, well, we want this space, but we have to make it so great that it's changing the way people are using it. And part of that is sort of linked to this idea of, trip chaining. It's something that's, not new. It's how we have been sort of designing our transit systems. So the idea is you have a transit station. We've all been talking about transit-oriented development for years. We also talk about the fact that people should be able to walk to transit stations or bike to transit stations. Though it is still surprisingly, we build transit stations today that have no bike parking. That is still quite common. But if we wanted to take it further, should, Uber and Lyft vehicles all have bike racks on them? We need to start thinking about how we connect all those pieces. If I do want to take a vehicle to a trail, how do I make sure if I want to take a bike to a trail in a vehicle, how do I make that happen? So looking at how all these different technologies are tied together and who has access to them.
Anyone want to add on to that? Keith, I want to kind of jump back to what Blaine was hitting on in kind of calling on trail advocacy community to, start thinking bigger, I guess is a way of saying it, right? As being something part of a larger geographically larger push or geographically more comprehensive push for walking and biking space. And I wonder if you can kind of add to that and make it specific to your
Well,
work.
I think we've been talking about trail systems, and to me that almost by definition means something that is regional, that is crossing a lot of local jurisdictional boundaries, that it's going to require more cooperation between local units of government. And I think it's also a reason why our metropolitan planning organizations and councils of government, those kinds of entities, are more important than ever. We've seen that in some of our project work, just in terms of the role that they could play, both here in our Badger project and as well in the Circuit project. And I think that it's just really important to have those partners on the governmental side who are representing a broader piece of geography than just the municipality. And so I think part of it is just really building those partnerships with people in the public sector as well as the private sector to look at things regionally and not just in terms of local jurisdictions, because that's not how people actually operate in the real world. We're crossing these boundaries in our daily lives all of the time. And so we really need to be, as we're planning for the future, anticipate that.
And I think what goes along with that regional focus is actually thinking about other economic activities, getting to work, commuting. E-bikes are going to really already are changing the commute radius that people can make on a bicycle. So, how can we think about moving from, trail use being kind of an optional recreational activity often to being a necessary activity that you fit in from 8 to 9 a.m. on your way to work. And that requires a regional focus because the jobs are different places from where the people live. And that, I think, has a real potential to get people out of their cars too, because that's where a lot of the trip generation comes from.
I do want to make sure we hit on the equity question, right? We touched a little bit on this at the beginning, but taking into consideration all of the modes that we just talked about, including bikes, which I'm kind of sad we didn't get to talk about, dockless bikes, dockless scooters, Uber, Lyft, autonomous vehicles. In your mind, Robin, what are the kind of, what's the future look like in terms of equitable access to these services and the rights of way that come with them?
We're over-investing in areas that have historically been left behind by capital investment. And it's a long, long history in cities of bad zoning policy of the 40s and 50s, bad transportation investments that tore down parts of neighborhoods, that have left cities and smaller cities and towns with the remnants of something that I don't believe the United States is proud of. And we have in so many cities areas that really have been typically underinvested in. I know for our our capital side, our capital investment, there are several cities, I would say Oakland is a leader. I would like to say Minneapolis is a leader, but it's a little self-serving, but we are. And DC is a leader. There are several leaders that are putting more money into areas of racially concentrated poverty. And that means that we're redoing the streets in those areas faster. And that means that we're putting people-centered transportation options into those communities faster. And they are not yet catching up. It will take a while to catch up to the rest of the city. So that's one part of it. That's one part of the equity thing, is the over-investment to bring them up. The other part is really related to technology. I am worried about the unbanked, and I am worried about those who don't have access to mobile technology being left behind. And I am hopeful for some solutions in that area, but I'm also fiercely defensive of public transportation, and never will be willing to give up on solid backbones of great bus service and train service that will do the job for someone who is unbanked or does not have a smartphone and can't access an Uber or an autonomous vehicle.
Thank you for that. I think we're going to open it up to questions from the audience at this point. I think we have a microphone stand right here if anyone wants to come on up. Questions? Yep, in the green shirt.
Just a quick question with no apparent answer to me. I'm guessing no one else either, but I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. You've listed all these things that are kind of coming. What I'm not hearing any more about is really improved rail service in the country and high-speed rail. Is that pretty much, that just isn't ever going to happen in this country? Because you're talking about things happening in the next 25, 30 years. I'm never hearing that discussed anymore, so I'm beginning to think that is that just going to bypass the U.S., or what are your thoughts about that?
I think it depends where you live. If you live in California, you're still hearing about it. I would guess you're still hearing about it, but it's
We hear about it all the time, but
Yeah.
I'm also not sure it's going to get built. So.
I think there's a broader political environment that is driving, that's the wrong word, that is governing the speed at which high-speed rail projects are moving forward. I am aware of a couple of coalitions around the country that are almost disbanded at this point because they haven't seen enough progress in the sub-region. I don't have I'm not sure anyone up here has an answer on the future of it. I think it's a great question, and we should lose sight of it.
Brightline did just open in South Florida, which is first privately funded high-speed rail, or high-speed rail in the American context, I guess. And there's a project that seems to be moving forward, probably in Texas. I don't know if it's totally dead, but that's interesting. I think I saw a question somewhere back there.
Dennis.
Oh. Yep. Okay.
So I wanted to just ask about sort of the context right now in our country. I feel like we have failed in a lot of ways. So we're talking about, some things that we're talking about are bright, shiny objects that just happen, and there's always going to be some shiny new things. But we currently, and I work with everybody, but I'm very distraught about our current political environment, especially on the federal level. And the amount that community has been torn asunder, so we don't feel connections between people. And we've been talking about that. How do we develop connections between rural and urban communities? But we have like differences in what is a fact, and things like that. And I think trails can play a role in connecting people tremendously, and that building community. But I was wondering, what do you think of what you've been talking about and other things that can actually build community and help us be the United States of America again?
Well, who wants to start on that one?
I'll take a shot on that, and let me use the route of the badger as an example in terms of the project that we have going on right here. I think that there are tremendous opportunities, and we're going to see some of it on the field trip, to really build some urban infrastructure that could greatly improve mobility and quality of life in some very much underinvested communities. At the same time, within the footprint of the project, we have the opportunity to make some investments in some small, rural, rather conservative places that is really focused on economic development. And these are places that really need an economic boost. They're often communities that were built around the railroad, and when the railroad stopped running, the lifeblood was lost for the community. And so I think that there's it's sort of a unifying opportunity within a regional footprint where it may have an urban, it may be very positive for an urban population for one reason, and very positive for a rural population for another reason. And we think there's really an opportunity to build a much bigger, broader coalition that is really about improving the quality of that place. And also, I think it's important in terms of pride of place. I think people really can be pulled together by the notion of we're going to make this a place we're proud of and a place where, where we want to raise our children.
I'll just add one other piece for what it's worth too. This is I think a great frame to look at it. It's urban and rural. It's also different parts of the city where there are aspects of mistrust because the populations are divided and not necessarily mixing. It's an interesting piece of research. I believe it's out of Princeton by Ryan Enos, who's a sociologist. Studied what happens when new populations move next to existing populations and whether bias goes up at that point. And he found that the closer they are and the less mixing there is, the more the bias goes up. So it's actually, a neighborhood can be almost integrated in the sense it's different people are close by, but if there isn't a meaningful way to interact with people who are different from you, the outcome can be actually quite bad. And so I think that's sort of what we have to look at in places where we have, in a lot of cities in California, it's 40% foreign-born, majority minority populations. These cities are changing rapidly, and trails and that kind of human infrastructure can serve a purpose there. But I think it has to be more than just the infrastructure. It has to be the retail offerings at different price points. It's got to be programming that invites everybody. And so adding all those pieces on to ensure that bias situation doesn't go up even though you're coming into contact with others.
Oh, great. Yep.
Thank you. My question is, we've seen the shared economy, obviously, with Uber and Lyft and other things, but people still love to own their own thing, and car ownership is definitely a point of pride for a lot of people. If it sounds like it's really important that we make autonomous be a shared piece of our society and not just single ownership. How do we do that? Is that legislative? Is it with incentives? And is my perception that people like owning their own thing also shared by you, or is that just an old school way of thinking?
I'll take a shot at that. I think that if we are going to move from the personally owned vehicle to the shared vehicle, I think the economics of this really have to work out right. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to be done by regulation. We're not going to tell people they can't own their own car. That's just not going to happen for a lot of the reasons you said, Katie. But there are studies that indicate that by 2030, the cost of mobility by demand by an autonomous vehicle summoned by your cell phone could be as much as 60 to 70% less than the fully loaded cost of owning that vehicle that sits parked 95% of the time. When you're paying for the purchase price, the insurance, the gasoline, the maintenance, the upkeep, when you add all that together, you could have a situation where family budgets could greatly benefit by just mobility on demand and not having to actually own that personal vehicle themselves. And I think that That again, may be pie in the sky, and we'll have to see what happens. But I think that these technologies are always getting cheaper. And I think that if those numbers add up, it will be so much easier to make sure that this actually happens, because I'm not sure it's going to happen through regulation. I think it's going to best happen through those kinds of market forces that are affecting family budgets.
I'm going to jump in here because I think it's always interesting when someone on a panel wants to offer a counterpoint.
So, please do.
I don't think we're going to regulate who can own what, but I do think we have an opportunity to regulate what happens in our cities with those vehicles. What happens on the curbside, how many people need to be in a vehicle to travel through the city. We're not doing that yet, but I do think the incentive is, of course, a great way to do it, and also, I think cities will regulate.
Another question? Yep.
I don't think I need to mic. So in this shared economy, because I live far away from the city but commute in every day, 40 to 50 miles, how does someone like me get into the city to then, like, are there multiple networks here? Are there 8-person cars that bring me into the city and then I transfer over? Like, what's in this future world, and this might be a future of tomorrow, but in this future world, how does someone that is very multimodal interact with the system?
This is something that if you look at NACTO's blueprint for an autonomous urbanism, it actually there's a whole page in there dedicated to different fictional people that travel every day. And I believe that what you're describing is in there as one of the scenarios. And it says in this fictional future that we're talking about, this fictional person, who has a name and everything, would take a bike or walk to some sort of transit or shared vehicle that brings them the most of the way, the distance, into a city to a mobility hub where there are then again more choices to get to your final destination, a walk, a bike ride, a different shared vehicle. But sometimes I think, wow, this is like, it's so much change, but then you give me this scenario and I'm like, it's actually not that different. What you need is a great bus line that takes you 50 minutes into the city and then choices on both ends for how you travel. And we're talking about autonomous buses or not autonomous buses, but the premise is the same.
And also I'll add to that just the sort of increase in microtransit. So the bus line that isn't, maybe you live in a rural enough area, so we can't justify the price unless we're only the bus is only traveling every 1 to 2 hours or something like that, right? And so you're probably not going to take it because what if you don't need to go then? Well, with apps and all this information that we're able to gather and share, you could have a bus system that would know when you wanted to go and communicate that, among all the other people who wanted to go in that general area. And so you'd be picked up much closer to the time that you actually wanted to travel, while then saving more money because there wouldn't be buses that were running when no one was there. Again, it's linked to smartphones and all of this technology that most of us have, but not all of us do. And so that, again, becomes, the person who's reliant on that fixed route system, how does that work? But yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? I have one more, if not. And that is, I wonder for this panel, for this audience, picking up on the counterpoint that you offered, or just the concept of a counterpoint, right? Are there voices, are there, representatives of some of these technologies we're talking about that you wish we, people in this room, perhaps had more of an opportunity to talk to and kind of fold into conversations like the one that's happening here today? Question for anybody.
We've been working with Ford for the last year and a half or so and interfacing with some of their new product development folks, really because we felt like they needed to have some people in the room with them who understood how a city works and didn't see the street as a place to mine for value to move their product through, to just put it bluntly. And I think there are people in these companies who do think, who want that. And I would say there's actually a dearth of people who really understand how the city works, working with these companies who are offering mobility as service. So I would say it goes both ways. I think we should hear more from them, but also urbanists need to get, and human-focused designers need to get involved with those companies. They need to be co-creating these products with them. I just, having watched sort of a car company work on this and heard some of what they're working on, this mobility as service thing, every car company is coming up with their version of it, and none of them know what they're doing. None of them actually really know what will work, and they're placing a lot of different bets to see what shakes out. So to answer the gentleman's question about, well, what is the service? I don't think anyone knows, even the people who are creating the services. But what will happen is, I think, as private car ownership is driven down by that market logic that Keith brought up, there will then be a lot of money to be made in mobility as service because we won't have the alternative. And I think we're going to see some things start to work that didn't work previously.
I would just tag on to that. I think dockless bike share, and also like the Razor scooters and a lot of the other things that we're seeing placed in the built environment. There is, I think, a desire to work with cities as long as cities are willing to sort of allow a certain amount of movement forward. And so what we often have is the sort of, quick tossing down of these systems because the cities aren't willing to discuss these things quickly enough, or the cities are quickly sort of throwing together some guidelines. And so that's another place. And I think it's only going to grow, especially with scooters and skateboards and all the other devices that are popping up, where we need to be able to have those conversations with those companies.
Thank you. I think one more hand. I think probably we have to. Oh, okay. Well, please. Quick question.
Speaks to his question, and I work in IT. 2 years ago, I was at a conference where the speaker was an autonomous guy specialist from Google, but 2 years is a long time ago, right? So maybe somebody from the metro planning organizations have already set it straight on whether this vision worked. But the vision that he proposed to the audience, because I asked his question exactly, I live in a rural area too, was that I would leave my house in a smaller unit, and then, that unit would be aggregated or drafted up to another unit when it joined the main highway, and that would just keep happening, and then when I needed to diverge off, my unit would break out of that unit and go to another unit, just like I was in a little VW or smaller. Does that have any merit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be a technical answer about how it can be done, and those are great. I'm glad there's people figuring that out. The question to ask is, what's that experience like? Do I get to meet my friends and neighbors along the way in that experience? Does that make me feel like a human being? I can feel, the environment. I can communicate with others. It creates empathy between me and the people around me. If so, great. Then, give me that solution. But if not, find me something else.
All right, we're gonna.
Things that you offer that like digital person would consider a unit.
We're gonna end on that note. So please join me to give me a round of applause for our panel.